The auctioneer had been trying to give it away for 4 minutes. It was the 25th of October, 1986, a wet Saturday on the old Brubaker place in Oley Township, Berks County, Pennsylvania, and Cy Tolliver had sold everything else on that farm in 5 hours flat. 200 and some people stood in the trampled grass with their coffee going cold. And the last big lot of the day stood in front of the bank barn where 4 men had spent an hour dragging it out of the mow on a hay rope. It was 9 feet tall. 4 posts of black oak, mortised and pegged, with a beam across the top, the thickness of a man's thigh, and squatting on that beam a slab of cast iron the size of a footlocker, so far gone in rust that it had no shape left to it at all. It had been painted once. Now it was the color of a dead maple leaf, and it had been standing in the dark under that barn roof for longer than anybody at the sale had been alive. Tolliver opened it at $200. Nobody moved. He came down to $100, and a man in the back said something to the fellow next to him, and the both of them laughed. He came down to $50, then to $25, and by then it had stopped being an auction and turned into entertainment. Somebody hollered that he'd give $5 for the pegs. Somebody else said it would make a fine hog scalder if you knocked the top off it. And then Dean Rasmussen, who bought scrap by the ton off a fenced lot on the Pricetown Road and wore the same mustard-tan jacket to every sale in 3 counties, pointed at the thing with his sale bill and said loud enough that it carried to the porch sigh, "That's a woodpile with a hat on." That got the biggest laugh of the day, which is when a heavy old man in blue denim bib overalls and a straw hat gone the color of weak tea raised one finger about as high as his shoulder and said, "45. The ask was $25. He bid $45. You could hear the yard rearrange itself. 200 people had just watched a man in overalls bid nearly double against nobody, out loud, in front of his neighbors, for something they had all agreed was firewood with a rust problem on it. There is a particular sound a crowd makes when it decides somebody has embarrassed himself, and it is not really laughter. It is quieter than laughter, and it goes on longer. Tolliver did not ask twice. He said sold, and he said the number, and he moved on to the hay rope. And behind him the laughing started up again in a different key. Not at the object any more, at the man. His name was Walter Hessling. He was 63 years old. He lived 12 miles away on the west side of Reading, and he had spent 42 years of his life doing one job that almost nobody in that yard could have named. Walter went into the Herbein Mills in Reading in 1939, at 16 sweeping under the frames. By 22 he was on the fixing crew, and by 30 he was the man they called when a figured loom quit. Not the plain looms, the figured ones. Bedspreads, damask table linen, anything with a picture woven into the cloth instead of printed on top of it. And every one of those machines ran off a cast-iron head bolted above the loom that read a chain of punched cards, 1 card at a time, and lifted a different set of threads for every single throw of the shuttle. A card with a hole in it lifted a thread. A card without one didn't. That was the whole trick, and it was invented in France before there was a Pennsylvania railroad. And Walter Hessling spent 42 years with his hands inside those heads, lacing chains and straightening hooks and picking rust out of needles with a sharpened spoke. The Herbein Mills shut the door in February of 1981 and sold the machines to a broker in North Carolina. Walter went out with a pension and a toolbox and 4 years of not knowing what to do with his mornings. So when a 9-foot oak frame came out of a barn mow in Oley Township with a rusted iron box sitting on the top beam, Walter Hessling was probably one of about 9 men left in eastern Pennsylvania who could look at it from 40 feet away and know exactly what he was looking at. But that is not why he bid. He bid because of something he could see hanging down under the iron, in the shadow, that everybody else read as a rat's nest. If you've made it this far into Walter Hessling's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Here is what a man like Walter sees when he walks up on a thing like that. The frame is a barn loom, handmade probably by a country joiner out of quartered white oak, and it is not a piece of furniture, it is a building. 4 posts, 2 side rails, a cloth beam at the front and a warp beam at the back, and above it all a superstructure carrying a Jacquard head with 400 hooks in it. Under the head hangs a comber board drilled with 400 holes. And through those holes drop 400 cords, and on the bottom of every cord hangs a thin lead weight the size of a pencil stub. There were supposed to be 400 of those weights. Walter counted the ones he could see and got tired at 90, and threaded over the cylinder inside that iron head, folded down in a stack against the post like a drop deck of playing cards, was the card chain. Still on it, still laced. That is the part nobody understood, and it is the part that made Walter Hessling bid $45 with 200 people laughing at him. Because a card chain is not part of a loom. A card chain is the job. It is the pattern, punched out 1 card at a time, and a chain for a full coverlet ran to 1,500 cards or better. And every one of them was hand-cut. Chains were the most valuable thing a weaver owned. When a weaver finished a job, he took the chain off, tied it up, and hung it on the wall, because the chain outlived the machine. When a weaver quit the trade, the chains went first, sold to the next man for real money. Nobody in the entire history of the craft left a chain on the cylinder. Walter paid his $45 in the trailer, took the yellow paper tag off the post with the number written on it in grease pencil, folded it once, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he got a rag and a can of kerosene out of his truck and walked back to his loom, and while the rest of the sale drifted toward their cars, he knelt on a feed sack and started working at the cover plate on the front of that iron head with a screwdriver and a flat file. It took him 35 minutes to get 4 bolts out. 2 of them he had to shear. The plate came away with a sound like a jar lid, and what was underneath it stopped the yard. The cards were dry. They were the color of strong tea, and they were stiff as slate, and they were packed solid in a rind of beeswax that had gone hard and yellow as a candle stub. And when the daylight got in on them for the first time since Zachary Taylor was president, you could see the holes. Hundreds of little rectangular holes in rows in an order somebody had chosen on purpose, still sitting exactly where they had been left. 8 or 9 men had drifted over by then. One of them was Dean Rasmussen. And a yard full of people who had spent 4 minutes laughing at a woodpile stood there in the wet grass looking at a thing that had plainly been made by a mind. And nobody said one word. Walter said, "That's the pattern." Rasmussen said, "Pattern for what?" And Walter said, "Won't know till I run it." Getting it home took 11 days and cost him more than 4 times what he paid for it. He paid a neighbor $60 for the use of a flatbed and a tractor with a loader. He paid the Brubaker estate $25 for 11 days of standing room. Because the sale contract gave a buyer 48 hours to clear his lot, and Walter needed 9 days more than that. He bought 200 feet of new rope, a roll of builder's felt, 4 moving blankets, and a case of penetrating oil, and he wore out a pair of gloves a day. You do not lift a barn loom. You take it apart, and the men who built them knew that, which is why every joint on that frame had a number chiseled into the oak beside it in Roman numerals. Post 1 to rail 1. Post 2 to rail 2. The joiner had cut those marks in 1830-something so the loom could be knocked down and raised again in a different room, and Walter Hessling followed a dead man's numbering system with a rubber mallet and a notebook and took the whole thing to pieces in his shirt sleeves in a cold barn. That was when he found the second set of marks. Chalk, faded to almost nothing on the inside faces of the posts where the weather never got at them, but chalk. In a different hand than the chisel, numbering the same joints over again. And on the back of the warp beam, wrapped in a piece of tarred canvas that had gone to shreds, the harness cords had been coiled and tied off in a bundle with the lingos still on them. Every lead weight laid the same way. Somebody had taken that loom down carefully. Somebody had taken it down the way you take a thing down when you are going to put it back up. The Brubaker family could not tell him a single thing about it. Harold Brubaker had died that August at 88 and had never woven in his life, and neither had his father. The loom had been in the mow above the cow stable since before anybody could remember, back behind the hay chute where you had to climb over it to get to the pigeonholes. The one answer Walter got from Harold's niece in the estate trailer was the answer everybody gets. It came with the place. He asked her whether anyone had ever said a name. She thought about it and said no, and then she said the family had always called that end of the mow the weaving corner, which is a strange thing to call a corner where no one has ever woven, and she had never in her life wondered why. His garage was 22 feet by 24, and the loom would not stand up in it without taking the light fixture down, so he took the light fixture down. The head came apart on the workbench over 3 weeks in kerosene and lard oil and finally in a shallow pan of vinegar, one piece at a time, and Walter drew every piece before he moved it. 400 hooks, 400 needles, each with its own little spring wire. A griff with 12 knives on it, seized solid. The cylinder itself, the 4-sided drum the cards ride over, frozen so hard on its shaft that he ended up building a wooden cradle and putting it in his oven at low heat for 2 hours to break the rust loose, which is a thing he never told his wife about until afterward. Every hook came out of that head in a paper envelope with a number on it, and the envelopes went into a shoebox in order. And Walter worked the way he had been taught to work in 1946, which is that you never have 2 parts loose on the bench at the same time. 31 of the 400 needles were broken. He made new ones out of music wire, sitting at the kitchen table with a jeweler's file and a magnifying lamp, for an evening, all through December. Marion Hessling had been married to him for 39 years and had a way of not asking. She asked exactly one question that whole winter in January, standing in the doorway with her coat on. "Are you going to be able to read it?" And Walter said no. Not by looking at it, because that is the thing about a card chain, and it is the thing that turned this from a restoration into the strangest waiting game I have ever come across. He could read the cards mechanically. Any Jacquard fixer can. You lay them out flat and the holes make a grid, and if you know the tie-up, you can more or less see the shape of the design coming, the way you can see a face in a half-finished crossword. And what Walter saw over about 2 months of laying out cards on his kitchen table on butcher paper, was a standard medallion field. Big rosettes in rows, a border of trees, a common enough figure. Handsome, but nothing that would make you sit down. Then he got to the end of the chain, and 2 things were wrong with it. The first was that the chain was not sewn into a loop. Every working chain is a closed circle laced head to tail, so it runs around and repeats forever. This one was cut. It ran out. The second was the last 180 cards. They were a different card, different stock, thinner and paler, and the holes in them had been cut with a different punch. One that left a slightly rounded corner instead of a square one. Somebody had hand-cut those 180 cards separately at a bench, one at a time, and laced them onto the end of a finished pattern chain. And when Walter laid them out on butcher paper, the holes made no picture at all. No rosette, no border, just scattering, in short broken rows. He sat with that for 4 days before he understood, and when he understood it, he stood up from the table so fast he knocked his chair over. A coverlet from that era carries a corner block. It is the woven signature in the bottom corner of the cloth, and it is the only part of the whole thing that is not decoration. It carries the weaver's name and a town and a year, and very often the name of the person the coverlet was made for. It is writing. Letters woven into wool. Walter Hessling was sitting in his kitchen in Reading, Pennsylvania, in the winter of 1987, looking at 180 punched cards that contained a sentence. And there was no way on this earth to read it except to build the loom and weave it. That took him until the 11th of June. He needed help, and he knew it. He got it from a hand weaver named Nan Yoder, who ran a guild out of a church basement in Kutztown and who did not entirely believe him on the telephone. She drove over on a Tuesday to be polite about it. And she stood in that garage doorway for a long minute without taking her coat off, and then she took her coat off. Between them, that spring, they hung 400 harness cords through a comber board and tied a lead lingo on every one. And a cord that hangs a 1/4 inch off pulls its thread crooked for the whole length of the cloth, so they measured every one of the 400 twice. They cut new heddles out of linen twine on a jig Walter made from a scrap of shelf board. They wound a warp of cotton, better than 1,000 ends of it, on a mill Nan built out of a bicycle wheel, and threaded every single end by hand, Walter reading the draft out loud and Nan on the stool with the hook, 4 days of it, and when they lost their place, they started the section over. They lost their place twice. He dyed the wool himself in a copper boiler in the driveway, indigo, because every coverlet he had ever seen out of that valley was indigo and white, and he was not going to be the man who got that part wrong. On the 11th of June, 1987, at about 4 in the afternoon, Walter Hessling stepped on the treadle of a loom that had last been worked in the administration of James Polk, and the cylinder came around and knocked against the needles with a sound he had been hearing since 1939. 4 beats and a pause. Chock, 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 the rosettes came first. 200 picks in, the first medallion stood up out of the cloth in indigo wool, and Nan Yoder put her hand over her mouth. Understand what that sound is. A Jacquard head does not know anything. It has no memory and no design in it. It is 400 hooks and a spring on each one, and all it does, over and over, is press a card against 400 needles and let the holes decide which threads go up. The pattern was never in the machine. The pattern was in the cards, and the cards were still exactly as one man had left them, and the machine was simply doing one pick at a time. What it had been told to do in 1849 and never got the chance to finish. They wove for 9 days, 2 feet, then a yard, then the border of trees, and it was by any measure an ordinary, handsome coverlet of a kind you can see 40 of in any county museum in Pennsylvania. And then the chain ran into those 180 pale cards. The letters came up sideways, the way they always do, so you have to stand at the end of the loom and turn your head. They came up one row at a time over about 40 minutes, and Nan read them out as they cleared the reed, and this is what the machine had been holding since 1849. Made by C. Rentschler for Catherine Oakenbach, Oley, W.P. Berks, C.O., 1849. Walter Hessling sat down on the bench behind his own loom and did not say anything for a while. 180 cards, cut by hand at a bench by a man who had been dead since before the Civil War, had just been handed to a machine, and the machine had done what it was told. Ruth Donor at the County Historical Society had the rest of it inside of a month, because it turned out not to be a mystery at all once you had the name. Christian Rentschler kept a weaver's shop on the Manatawny Road and appears in the county records from 1836 to 1849, and his output is in the checklist that the coverlet people keep, dozens of pieces all signed. And then the entries stop. They stop in the summer of 1849. And 1849 is the cholera year in that part of Pennsylvania, and the burial record for the Reformed churchyard has him going into the ground on the 29th of August, aged 44. 2 of his own household went in the same week. He had a job on the loom when he died. The chain was cut because he had punched the corner block last and laced it on, which is exactly how you did it. And he had gotten the pattern chain loaded and the warp beamed and had not yet thrown the first shuttle. The shop was sold off that autumn. And somebody, some careful somebody, took that loom down joint by joint with chalk in his hand, numbering everything, coiling the cords, folding the chain, and hauled it 4 miles up the valley and put it in a barn mow. The farm that barn stood on was the Auchenbach place. It went out of the family in 1911, and the people who bought it were named Brubaker. For 137 years, a machine sat in the dark, in the house of the woman whose name it was holding, spelled out in punched holes that not one living person in that valley could read. Catherine Auchenbach's line was still in Oley Township. Ruth Donor traced it in 9 days across 4 churchyards and a family Bible. Catherine had married a man named Peter Klein in 1851, 2 years after the coverlet was ordered and never delivered, and her great-great-granddaughter was a woman named Verna Klein, 81 years old, in a brick house on the square. On a Sunday in August of 1987, Walter and Marion Hessling carried a folded coverlet up her front steps. Verna Klein had grown up on that farm. She had played in that mow. She told Walter she used to hide behind the frame when her brothers came up the ladder, and that she had always thought it was part of the barn, like the beams were, and she had never once in 81 years asked anybody what it was. They opened it out on her dining room table, all of it, the rosettes and the trees and the corner, and Walter turned the corner block around so it faced her the right way up. She put on her glasses to read her own family's name, and then she put her hand down flat on the wool and left it there. She asked how much he wanted for it, and Walter Hessling told her it was not his. and had never been his, and that he had only run the machine. The coverlet is in the County Historical Society now. Verna put it there herself, on loan, with a card beside it that gives the weaver's name and the year in one more line, about 138-year delay in delivery. Dean Rasmussen came out to the garage in September to see the loom standing. He looked at it a long time, and what he said in front of Walter's neighbors was that he had been buying and selling other men's belongings for 29 years and had never once in his life stopped to ask what one of them was for. Walter Hessling ran that loom for 11 more years. He kept the yellow paper tag in a canning jar on the shelf above the warp beam, $45 in grease pencil. The price of a woodpile with a hat on. And he kept a thing his old boss, Emil Stauffer, used to say to him at the mill, back when Walter was 19 and impatient and wanted to strip a chain off a cylinder to get at a bent hook underneath. Stauffer would put one hand flat on the cards and say it every time, in the same tired voice, like a man explaining water. A loom holds its place. He had held it for 137 years, in a hay mow, in the dark, waiting for somebody to come along who knew that the pile of junk in the corner was not a pile of junk at all. It was a sentence, stopped in the middle, and it was still perfectly capable of finishing itself. All it needed was $45 and a man who could hear the difference.